put together on this topic.
And Wendy, I'm going to jump in with one thing quickly. If people can drop in any questions they have in the chat, and I will, call you out during the presentation to jump in with your question, but we'd love to make this interactive. So please drop your questions in the chat.
Yeah, and it would be great for as many of you who are able to turn on your video so I can see your lovely faces. That would be awesome. Cool. So let me figure out how to share my screen. All right, can you all see this?
Yes.
Fantastic. I'll make it bigger. So today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is, how to actually add value as a venture investor. I think, it's becoming an increasingly competitive market out there. As we've all observed, there's just an abundance of venture capital, and I think this puts the entrepreneur in the driver's seat when it comes to many fundraising conversations with deals speeding to close in as short as less than a week. And so I think a lot of the kind of conversation that I have with founders once we're past the point of us getting conviction is really on how we're able to be a true partner and be someone that they want around the table at kind of very early stages of their company building. And of course, this conversation sounds different as a board member versus a board observer, but really I think of it in a spectrum as you kind of first, start to develop these relationships. And I'll talk more about what that spectrum looks like later, but, maturing all the way to becoming a board member, I think it's my favorite part of the job, quite honestly, beyond sort of the deal sourcing and the deal dynamics. I think that part's incredibly fun as well. But for me, it's really about the relationship. So a little bit about North Zone. How do you present? Oh, okay, there you go. So North Zone is a global venture fund. We invest in Europe and the US, mostly on the East Coast. We've been investing for over 24 years, and we're investing out of our 9th fund. It's a $500 million Series A and B fund. We also have a seed program, and our check size anywhere from 1 million to in kind of these seed rounds up to 20 million in leading sort of Series Bs. Right now, we're a team of 30 people. And we have offices in London, in Stockholm, and New York, and Amsterdam, and Berlin. So here you see some of our recent winners. It's been a great year, actually, for North Zone. We just introduced 7 new unicorns to the portfolio in 2020 alone, and some of those include Tier, they include Hopin, they include TrueLayer, Fubo TV, Personio, Kahoot, many others, many of which did super well this year. So my experience at North Zone, so I've been in venture for 5 years, and prior to North Zone, I started a company called Cohatchery here in New York, and I got my MBA at Columbia, and prior to that, I worked in management consulting for a lot of the incumbent industries that our tech companies are trying to disrupt right now, like retail and logistics, et cetera. And I would, at a very high level, my investment approach is looking at kind of really interesting tech trends that are really on the fringes of like Reddit and developer forums, and triangulating that with consumer behavior to understand how companies can be built in that space. And so my sweet spot is usually pretty early. I'd say seed or pre-A or A, I think it is kind of when I tend to invest. And my board experience right now consists of the companies you can see there. So Spring Health, which is one of my investments at North Zone, I am an observer there. And it's a Series B company. LivePeer, Magic, 3Box. My most recent investment is a home services startup here in New York. It's still unannounced. And then I also inherited some companies from partners I worked with when I first joined, such as Cefello, Activate, Jukely, and Capital, most of which are exited. So I would say my experience at North Zone perhaps will differ from some of yours that are at larger funds, because when I first joined, we were not 30 people, we were more like 10. And it was really interesting to be able to participate or observe on the board immediately after joining, even though I didn't source the investments, to have a more direct relationship with CEOs. I think some of you asked about how to form that relationship. I'm happy to talk more about that later as well. But it was very much a gradient sort of process from having my exposure at the board at sort of an introductory level up till today, where I'm taking board seats. And it was a very kind of smooth transition. How do I go to the next slide? Okay, so this is why I think boards are important in general, and some of this is obviously pretty self-explanatory, but also why it's important to me. So, in my experience, the best boards that I've been a part of have given founders fuel and clarity for the future direction of the company, rather than making them feel like it's an audit process and like, what did you do wrong, and what, justifying their position to the board. I had a interesting conversation with a founder today, and she said that a lot of her experiences have been about defending the company to the board, and that to me is not a productive board conversation. I think boards are supposed to give founders and executives energy for the future of the company, rather than drain them of energy. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a cheerleader all the time, because of course smart people, they get bored of that, and they hate just having sort of cheerleading fed to them. I think it's important to focus on sort of productive issues, or focus on issues in a way that creates a forum for productive discussions and brainstorming. Obviously, boards are supposed to provide governance for the company, and a lot of times it's also a way for the founders to give airtime and recognition to their key executives, and they have them present kind of on their functional areas to the board. And this could be a lot of work that they put into that. And personal, yeah.
Just to jump in, can you just share a little bit about, in terms of like facilitating those more productive sessions in a board meeting? Are there any ways that you try and practice that, or any things that you do, like in terms of the way you ask questions, etc., to help facilitate that?
Open-ended questions, I think, are really, really important. And I'll conclude the session with a list of more tactical things you can do, which includes, how to ask those open-ended questions. But I think generally, founders have the answer always, and it's more about asking them more probing and open-ended questions to understand how they're arriving at their various answers, and what keeps them from going full force conviction into one of the directions, and helping them uncover a lot of their either assumptions or biases or fears, or kind of excitement around where they are in the business. Usually, this conversations happen in the boardroom, but it can happen outside of the boardroom as well. I think we'll talk a little bit about the different roles that a board member or board observer can play for a founder. But how I usually do this is frame the question in a way that has boundaries, and say, between this option and this option, you've thought through what are the different considerations or trade-offs. Usually that's like a good framework for introducing an open-ended question that allows them to do more explorative talking rather than defend their position. It also helps you get more information to understand how they're viewing the market, and maybe you have some insights to add from their competitors that are raising rounds and things like that. But generally, when you ask why instead of why not, or more kind of discrete questions, it gets them talking. But I will say a lot of a good board meeting should never be a surprise to a founder. Like, I've heard that said. And so the best founders will actually try to engage all the members of the board prior to the meeting and make sure that their key concerns are addressed, so that they can have these more productive conversations, rather than having to go down the rabbit hole on one issue that a board member is really, really upset about. And I would encourage that as a board observer to ask the founders if they've looped in every single person that they should before that could be something that you could do that's value adding. And so why boards are important to me, I talked a little bit about it already. It's really, for me, venture is really a people business. It's the relationships that you're building along the way. And I mean this wholeheartedly, even though it can sound, kind of cheesy. I think most relationships with the founders that I've built have been, from the point of investment or from the point of meeting them through diligence and then investing to being on the board. A lot of it is outside of the boardroom. And being a founder is such a lonely journey. I've heard this said from so many founders, and you guys have probably as well. So being a person that has the context of that personal relationship, but also the business context of the exact sort of questions that they're thinking about from an org or a market perspective, it's a really unique role that you can play that is special, and I think pretty fulfilling for me as I continue to go into this job. So this is something that I posted a few months ago when I was doing the soul searching around what kind of board member I wanted to be. And I started to do some pattern recognition and data collection around the VCs that I know, and ones that I didn't but wanted to meet. And I did a series of interviews with a lot of veteran and new VC partners, and to ask them usually what they do with their founders, what their relationship looks like. I characterize them into these kind of memified archetypes, but I think when I ran this across a lot of the founders that I've worked with, they think it's really true. And they could name specific names for all of these archetypes. So I won't go through all of them here, but some of them are pretty self-explanatory. And if you want to dive deeper into it, you're welcome to check it out on my Substack. But there's like the veteran VC who's someone that's been in the industry for 20 plus years and saw several tech paradigms and can offer all sorts of amazing pattern recognition on company building that as a new board observer you just won't be able to, because you haven't had that experience. And these folks are generally less likely to have as much time as well to build these like deep personal relationships with early stage founders, the same point that you're investing in them, because they probably have 20 plus portfolio companies. And so I think against each one of these roles, there's a way to differentiate and a way to sort of grow into your own style. There's the cheerleader who's always just hyping up the founder, making them feel good about themselves. There's the ghost who's there and maybe a cheerleader when things are going well, but disappears when things are going bad. There's silent money investors who don't really think, that they don't really try to play too active in a role on the board, but they're great kind of financial investors and good partners to have on board from that perspective. And then the operator, the ex sort of founder, has its pros and cons. And the role that I identify with the most, which is kind of the one I'm continuing to build towards, is the therapist role. If you can tell already from some of the descriptors I've already mentioned, it's the one that is really there via text, really accessible, but asks a lot of probing questions. The founder comes to me when they have issues with their other board members or issues with their key executive team members, or sometimes personal issues. And it's a pretty time intensive role, but it's one that I find really fulfilling. And in that role, it's important to like figure out how much time you want to spend on certain issues and prioritize your time around that.
Wendy, of the boards that you've been on or just the experience you've had, which of these kind of like archetypes have you found are usually come with like the best board members? You said you were the therapist. Like, as people think about the type of board member they want to be, which ones would you kind of like steer them towards?
I think it really depends on the company, and I'm not a therapist to every one of my founders, only some, right? Like some just don't have the need to build as deep of a kind of relationship talking about things that are personal to them, but they're more willing to stay on kind of the business topic. So I think it really depends on the founder, but I think the therapist and everybody needs a cheerleader, and everyone needs some pattern recognition from the veteran. And I think there are founders that need someone that can hold them accountable to the numbers and ask them probing questions about their financial forecast, preferably before the board meeting when they share the materials, but maybe also during. And then there's also experts that can make really great industry and sector intros and customer intros and help them accelerate their pipeline by 6 months or something. So I think this is a really not a good answer, but my answer is there's room to differentiate, right, on the personal level. And that's why I think there is this thing called the VC value add, and it really depends on what you and what the founder and the company needs.
Awesome.
Except for the power tripper, I think, that one is, nobody needs that. So on being a good board member, it's definitely a learning process, right? And I think when you first get into venture, or definitely when I first joined, I hadn't paid much attention to this role and didn't really get the process as much as I had after I accepted a couple of board observer roles. And I think there's not enough education and attention paid to this. In general, there's a lot of really good research on how to be a good coach and how to be a good advisor. But I think, in the paradigm of venture capital that we were operating in maybe the 2 decades prior, capital was scarce. And there was a lot of capital that was seasoned that came with a lot of power. And I think the dynamics are changing again, to my point earlier, where, capital is not scarce and people are scarce. And so I think the best venture capitalists have over time realized that, being a good partner and being a good board member is such a skill. But I still see such terrible behavior from venture capitalists on boards, and I'm sure you have or will have in the future as well. And so I think it's a skill that needs to be practiced and refined. And how usually folks get these different sort of stages is, as I mentioned, you'll be an observer in a company you probably didn't source
Wendy,
and inherited.
just really quickly before you dive into the stages, one of the questions that came through was, how to what's the process of getting that first board observer seat? I'm assuming it's probably around the time where you enter a firm that you're at, and they may have a formal process or they may not. Like, did you raise your hand around it? How did it work at your firm? How have you seen it work at other firms for people who are in associate and principal roles, are not on a board yet, but would like to be?
Yeah, I think a lot of times it is you raising your hand, but also there are opportunities where, let's say, a portfolio company of another partner is looking for funding and they need operational support to put together a fundraising process. I think that's a great time to raise your hand, or potentially you'll get tapped by that partner. And it's not always the most glorious companies that are sort of rocket ships that you start with, right? Like, I think every portfolio has sort of companies that are doing well at the time and companies that are not doing so well at the time. And it's usually the ones that are not doing so well at the time that need the most operational support at the time. And so, for example, during kind of the whole PPP process was a great point for a lot of people to get involved and get exposure to the founders during that first scary era of COVID. And I tend to think you should seize those opportunities to get your hands dirty and get that exposure, because those relationships, will last beyond the company. And the work that you do for that company will resonate across your firm and to other founders in the future. And so, it's a little bit of just kind of being opportunistic, but also when I inherited some of the board roles, it was to help with another partner who recruited me, who had too many board seats at that point. But we shared those board roles together, and I was able to build kind of individual relationships with the CEOs.
Awesome. Great.
Cool. And so, stages, you can inherit some companies and then you source the company, and then you should always ask to be a board observer. I think if you've sourced the company, even if one of your partners takes the board seat, it can be formal or informal. Sometimes it's in the docs. A lot of times founders prefer it not be in the docs, but it's usually a pretty relationship-based thing. And, I haven't been asked yet to leave as an observer in any of my companies, and generally they don't.
If you're doing it informally, do you think it's important to make it an official thing, to be officially on the docs, you are a board observer? That's one of the questions that just came through.
Well, that's what I mean by informally. So a lot of times founders prefer you don't have an observer role papered. So it's one of those things you can decide during term sheet negotiations what you want to do. There's flexibility there, but for me, the ones where it's been formalized in the docs versus not, it's been the same relationship.
Great.
You can feature it on your LinkedIn as a part of your resume. It doesn't have to be papered for that. So And then, then you'll move on to roles where you're the only one managing the relationship, either as an observer or a board member for your firm. And I think that, that transition is usually pretty smooth once you've had a couple of observer roles where you're playing more of a core role, core role. So I think one of the questions you guys sent in is responsibilities as a board observer. So, there's the coaching that I talked about earlier. There's a lot of tactical support that you can help with on, financial modeling, helping them source candidates. A lot of times founders will have requests for hires. You can connect them with a portfolio team or do some sourcing on your own. Helping introduce them to customers. I think that tends to be one of the most high leverage areas of value add, especially as a board observer, because presumably you're less busy than the board member at that point. And then also continue to help support the investment decision and really evaluate whether or not you should be investing more capital into the company. I think a lot of times these follow-on decisions are harder than the initial investment decisions, at least for North Zone. And so being able to apply kind of your lens based on how close you are to the team, I think is going to be a huge value add for the firm. And then fundraising support, introducing them to other investors and helping them prepare their pitch. And so,
Wendy, one question that came in, just kind of going back to the stages and like the different dynamics that you may face in the boardroom. If one of your so if you're an observer and one of your partners, i.e. your boss, is a board member, how does that kind of change the way that you interact in a board meeting and or interact with the founder? Is it that every time you connect with a founder, your partner is CC'd? Can you have that personal relationship? How much do you speak up when you're an observer and they are also in the room? Do you coordinate that before? We got a bunch of questions on this.
I think that is a question that depends a lot on your firm culture and the partner you're working with and the relationship they have with the founder. Personally, I err on the side of asking for forgiveness rather than permission, because if you have a personal relationship, it's a personal relationship, like your friends, you're probably closer in age to the founder than the partner. You probably have much more of a mutual network that's social. And so if you can build that relationship, that personally, I would say, why not? That doesn't mean the founder will always come to you for strategic topics, and maybe they shouldn't, depending on how you delineate that responsibility with your partner. But it's good to have several channels, I would think, to a company and to a founder, and several dimensions of strong relationships. I mean, I think for a firm that can't be anything but helpful. But I have heard stories of folks being defensive around their founder relationship. So I think it depends, right? Like you got to navigate that a bit, but I err on the side of asking for forgiveness.
Awesome.
So, I mean, these are fairly tactical tips that I think I try to apply even in my board member roles. And so, I think one of the first times that when I was hired 5 years ago, a partner like ever yelled, and this partner never yells, at me was when I was late to a board meeting. And it was such a shocking thing for me, because he is the most sort of easygoing, not angry, non-confrontational person I've ever met. And, then he explained to me, like, I had to make it very clear to you, because for founders, they pour so much time and energy into prepping for board materials. And they're so nervous. And to not sort of dedicate that same level of like respect and energy back in the board meeting, it's so disrespectful. You need to really meet them where they are in terms of their energy and how much they have invested into like this next session and this conversation you're going to have. And so, and also it's just a good way to like connect informally, with other board members and founders and team members there, because you don't get a lot of forums to socialize. Sometimes people have like board social gatherings, sometimes they don't. What I like to do also is to ask to receive metrics, like the pure number oriented part of board meetings ahead of the meeting, and then review those and ask all of my like really discrete, concrete questions that are not open-ended before the board meeting. So like, why did your sales forecast for this business line like look different, but you didn't explain it here. I mean, this kind of like audit type questions, I try to knock them out before the board meeting if they don't address it already. Usually they address it in the materials, but it's better than derailing an entire board meeting to dive deep into like a numbers discrepancy. Sometimes there can be an Excel error too. And I think this is maybe where you can add more value as an observer, because you have sort of, the ability to dive deeper into those materials. And so what I also like to do is to develop probing questions to ask about every single strategic topic, even though I'm probably not going to ask most of them because it's going to happen throughout the course of conversation. And the reason I do that is because it helps you to stay focused and form an opinion or a thought or a hypothesis, just basically to go deeper, one level deeper on whatever is being presented to you. And that I think can help you sound smarter than others that haven't sort of gone that level deeper into the materials, or it helps you ask more, intelligent questions or direct the conversation. It also engages you more when you're able to do that, right? And gives you more energy.
Wendy, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to go next one. So
okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just on this point, I think the question that we got almost probably the most from everyone is just, how do you find your voice in the boardroom? It's obviously a process, especially probably when you first start out, but like, what was that process like for you? How did you gain confidence as you've now been doing this on several boards?
Yeah, it's not always straightforward, and it depends a lot on your relationship with the partner that you're on the board with, but also how prepared you are. I think those are the two biggest variables. The other variable, which I would almost recommend you sort of remove, is the filter you have on yourself on like, is this thing that I'm about to say smart enough? Because I think the chances, I think someone told me once that if you're asking yourself that question already, you're already filtering your thoughts more than 99% of people who are like talking. So I've heard some pretty dumb things said during board meetings, and not dumb in not meaning to put anybody down, but just sometimes people don't think before they talk. And so I think just being a woman venture investor, like sitting in a boardroom, you're gonna have so many more filters already than everybody else in that room, and so you should just talk. And obviously never talk to hear yourself speak, but ask, is this a question that pushes the team's thinking further in this area? And if that is a check mark, just like say it. And then I think the other dimension is just to make sure you have these like thought processes and hypotheses on each of the strategic topics before going into the meeting. And also that helps you feel more confident when you're in the meeting too. You should definitely align with the board member from your firm on what the objective of the conversation should be from like your firm's angle, because I think sometimes you don't want to be overshadowing others in the room. If you have a board seat and an observer seat, it's usually one more body than someone else has in that boardroom. And so I think you want to make sure you guys are talking the same language and steering in the same topics. And I think another way to find your voice is if you're on a topic and the board member is asking a bunch of questions or asking some probing questions, you can help reframe them and give like concrete examples to steer towards a topic. But usually, when I was an observer in certain companies with other partners, we would sync up before the board meeting for a few minutes and say, what did you think? What was your reflection on like the team's psychological state when they put this together? And like, where should we push them to flesh out their thinking further? And where do we feel like, they're really excited about and why? And number 5, I talked about already, speak up when you have something unique to add. Your BS filters are stronger than other people's. That's an assumption. Acknowledge that the solution never comes from the board, but always comes from the company. So I think a lot of times, founders already know the answer. They just need to be asked the right questions to come to kind of more realizations about the answer that they already have. And if it's clear that there's a blind spot and you ask them questions around that blind spot, they usually get to that blind spot. I think it's delusional for VCs to think that they can do it better than the founding teams. And so that's another sort of guardrail I put on the way that I interact with the teams in the boardroom and out. And then be super transparent about the conflicts of interest that exist. So, right, I talked earlier about making the deal decision to follow on in a company. That is probably one of the biggest conflicts of interest, because of that decision that you have to make, a lot of times founders feel like they have to justify the company to you always so that you'll continue to want to hype them up and invest in them. But I think, people that we all work with are really, really smart, and they know that we have these conflicts of interest. So my personal take is you spell it out up front and say, like, here's me as a friend telling you what I think. Here's me as a board member speaking in the best interest of the company. And here's me as a North Zone representative speaking in the best interest of my LPs. And like, here are my 3 perspectives. They're all biased, but like, take it for what it is and process. And I think that, yeah, you're going to ask a question.
Yeah. No, I think that is such a great point, because, to your point, there sometimes feels like there's like conflicts, but framing it in like these are the 3 different perspectives I can have. And, how do you kind of tease that out a little bit? How do you go back afterwards? You've had the board meeting, and had those interactions. How do you go back afterwards and kind of like report back to your firm in terms of like how they're doing? How do you position that post work?
Well, I don't know that, I don't know how other firms work, but at Nordstrom, we don't report back after every board meeting. We do these quarterly reports for our LPs, which are based on board materials, and it's an honest reflection of the performance of the company, but it misses a lot of the nuances of what happens during board meetings. When we have investment decisions, we take all of the board meetings we had and sort of the market knowledge that we've gained since the execution of the company. And I would say we try as much as possible to make that an objective analysis of the company's competitive positioning. But it's so many data points together that not one board meeting is going to influence it. And also, I think investors also see through when you are only telling them the good news, right? I think that is a signal of a bad board relationship. When you only hear the good news, you never hear the bad news. You can't help them, they can't help you. It's like, then why are we even here, right? Like, why are we spending this time together choosing to engage on this topic? For me, that's a waste of time.
Great.
So yeah, I said earlier, kind of meet the founder where they are. It's very general sort of human empathy, right? Like, they're probably really nervous if they're going into a fundraise, and if they get some bad initial investor feedback, you might see it reflected in all of their board materials if you happen to have a board meeting. It's important to like understand the role that you need to play when they're in that mindset. A lot of times founders are so hard on themselves. They're the hardest on themselves out of like any people I've ever met. And so it's more about taking them out of that rabbit hole and helping them see like a higher level perspective. There could also be chances when they're just overly optimistic and overly aggressive. I don't come across that as much, but it's important to kind of be in the same mindset for your voice to be heard, and keep the conversation going after the meeting. Be super, super responsive. Whenever my founders text me, they get a response like immediately, like faster than my husband. And even if it's not like something I can do right now, I will say like, I'm working on it. And I think they appreciate that. As I say, sort of most of the relationship building happens outside of the boardroom. And then just lastly, I think it's important to be good at your job. You have to put the company's needs above your own in how you communicate. And so, a board meeting or a board relationship is never about you justifying your investment to the company or to yourself. I mean, that's the weirdest sort of types of board conversations I've heard. And it's like, well, I invested in this thesis. Why aren't you executing it this way? And what's wrong with this? And what happened to this original hypothesis? It's like, it's not, it just doesn't do anybody any good to go down that line of kind of conversation. And so, yeah, I think that's it in terms of tactical tips.
Awesome. Wendy, just a quick follow-up on one of the things you mentioned. So you were talking about like that relationship building that happens outside of the boardroom, and shared a lot about how you can do that directly with the founder in terms of how you structure your relationship with them. How do you think about building relationships with other board members? I think like being in a boardroom is also a great place to get exposure for yourself. Maybe if
Yeah.
you're thinking about going to another firm or whatever it may be. How have you built relationships with other board members or seen people do it in an effective way?
Yeah, I've actually built a lot of really great relationships. Some of whom are the people that I interviewed for that post around, the board archetypes. Um, and I think, it's pretty. You get a lot of chances to talk about different topics in those forums, and usually, if you follow up immediately on a thread, let's say, you talked about this interesting development in the industry from like a layer above where your company that you mutually invested in is operating. You can send them a list of companies that you're looking at in that space and probe deeper into that investment thesis. Follow up on these threads that you have in the board meeting. Um, I'm not a good note taker, but you should probably take notes and refer back to them. And those can be good places to store some of these threads. But I think people will respond if you say, "Hey, like really enjoyed serving on this board together," and email them and say, "Can we please schedule up, a coffee or something to chat for 30 minutes?" I mean, it's kind of like how you build relationships in every other part of venture.
And then another question that came in, and then I'd love to open it up to other people who want to jump in with a question. Another question that came in, again, around board dynamics. So how do you deal with CEOs who are not receptive to feedback, or situations in a boardroom where there's like a significant disagreement, maybe with the board versus kind of the CEO? How do you think about handling each of those situations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot like, how do you tell a friend that won't, listen to your advice on a certain topic? I mean, I think with CEOs that are non-responsive, it's usually because they don't trust you on to offer advice about that particular topic, like, quite honestly. And maybe they are right in not trusting you, because you either don't have the closeness to like their customers or the latest sort of market insight, and you're not operating in the business. But a lot of times it's like a personal thing, right? And so it can be helpful to distance yourself a little bit from the board. As an observer, it's easier to do that because you have no formal vote. You can come at it from a more of a perspective of like, "Hey, I'm an observer informally, but I don't actually represent a board member, but I wanted to, like, talk to them from more of a personal angle and try to understand their frustrations with the board." They might just be frustrated with the board or one of the other board members. Um, and I think, yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to being empathetic and building that personal relationship.
Awesome. And then I want to open it up to questions. If I've been getting a few that I've been jumping in with. One that just came through: how do you build trust and credibility with founders? Do you find that certain sorts of experience are particularly valued, i.e., MBA, operator, industry experience?
I think ideas are valued, and experience is certainly valued, though I think as most of us go into our first observer roles, we don't have as much of that to offer as a seasoned operator or a veteran venture capitalist. And I think we shouldn't try to come from that perspective, because unless you have been like a product manager for like 10 years or something and running a product org before joining venture, that certainly wasn't the case with me. I was a management consultant, like, and got my MBA. Is like as generic as it gets. And so I think if you come from that position, it's not authentic, and they'll see right through that. It's not a game you'll win, unless of course you have a ton of experience. I think actually sometimes those types of like comments get discounted, but I think observations and ideas that are purely like, coming from your own unique perspective, either you're close to the market or the competitors, or you just know how the executives work with each other and what their like politics are like, those can be more valuable in a board setting. I know it's not very concrete, but it's yeah, again, about finding what you bring. Maybe you're like a Gen Z consumer and none of the other board members are that, and they're like, you know, old farts that don't know what TikTok is. I think, like, for example, with one of my companies, I show them a bunch of content from the subgenre that they're really interested in building into the product on TikTok, and like no other investor of theirs plays on TikTok. And so, you know, it's a weird, you know, minor form of value add, but it's a unique perspective. I think if I tried to say, like, from my consulting days, I saw them like execute in this like supply chain from like 10 years ago, it's just not going to resonate. It's probably going to get discounted.
Awesome. I want to open it up. Any questions that people want to jump in, unmute themselves and show themselves on video for? All right, well, I can ask one final question that came through. What is the most important piece of advice you wish you had before you ever joined like your first board meeting as an observer?
Most important piece of advice, just how selfless you have to be, like, to do a truly good job at this, like not just being a board observer, but being like a venture investor in general. You have to truly like own that selfless role, because as soon as you make it about yourself, you're doing a bad job. Does that make any sense? Like,
yeah. Awesome. Well, Wendy, thank you so much. If there are not any more questions before we wrap?
Yeah, sure. I have a question. So I've been in this situation a couple of times where, and at my firm, we don't have like a formal papered like it's not in the term sheet or anything. And maybe this is just me, but sometimes you get the sense, like a CEO in a board meeting will make a comment like, oh, these board meetings are getting very large. Maybe next time we'll have more of like a closed session. And I think this is probably company by company. Like, I definitely haven't taken it personally. And my approach has been obviously just talking to the actual board member from my firm to ask like, hey, should I stop going? But do you have any like thoughts on that? I'm curious if that's something other people have experienced. I think it happens naturally as subsequent rounds are raised.
yeah.
And what I've tried to do is give more thought into being more proactive. And, you know, if we lead the seed and then a company's at a Series C thinking maybe I should surface this to the board member before it becomes a topic. But that's just one random thing that I've thought about.
Anybody else want to share similar experiences, stories? Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in different ways this has happened in different companies in our portfolio. Sometimes boards just do get really big, right? And like, not every board member or observer is going to be selfless about how they conduct their communications. And also just in general, when you have 20 people in a room, it's harder for people to be more direct and engaged. And so, you know, then I think a lot of that board role when boards get big actually happens outside of those settings. Those meetings tend to become, you know, a little bit more showy. But, you know, I think what's happened in some of those meetings, it's like we'll have a session with everybody and then we'll have a session minus the other executives, and then we'll have a session sometimes without the observers. And that's one way of seeing companies deal with it. But yeah, I think it can be, you know, I think most of what I'm seeing is early stage boards, like pre-Series C. And I think that's definitely something that happens in later stage companies.
Yep.
I just have one question on board format. We have, like in our portfolio, we've had a couple of portfolio companies try different things. Like one team will do a pre-recorded board video, and then we'll focus the board session just on strategic discussions. One of them will share a memo prior to the board, and then again more focus on strategic discussions. I'm curious if you've just seen any interesting ways to structure board meetings that can drive the most value to founders.
That's really interesting. Pre-recorded board videos. I feel like that would save.
It's great.
Yeah. So I think the best formats that have worked for me have been in person. Like there is just something about being there that is tangibly different. I know that's very taboo in COVID times, and maybe anti-future, but I think that, board meetings will still, many of them, be in person. I think the formats that have worked the best is like you get the discrete and like concrete stuff out of the way via writing or video, it sounds like you can do, and then you do just like the open-ended discussions, in either a smaller group or in person or live or whatever over video. Sometimes my board meetings with really early stage companies, it's like 3 topics, and then they'll send me the other updates over email, but we'll just focus discussing on like 3 core strategic topics and then help come to a decision on how to operationalize each of those topics in the board meeting.
Awesome.
Can I jump in with one question?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy, for sharing your insight and experience. You've mentioned having a mix of board roles and board observer roles, and I'd just be curious to hear kind of your first board role. Did it evolve from an observer seat and then you took over the board position, or kind of how did you get that first board role? And to the extent that your firm is collaborative in approaching kind of who takes what seats, how have you decided the mix of like when to step into the board role and when to be an observer, and who to ask to be your observer if you're in the board position?
Yeah, great questions. So I have never converted an observer seat into a board seat, though I did have the option to do that once, but it turned out I wasn't eligible for some reason. I'm not in Europe, but so I've not done that. But I think my first board role was a deep relationship I'd built with an entrepreneur. I'd sourced and led the investment. I pounded the table to get it done, and I helped them form a syndicate for that round. And so it's me and the 2 co-founders who serve on the board. So it's a fairly informal board. How I decide to take that role versus someone else at the firm is, I did that when I was, I think, on my path to being promoted to principal, but I was still a senior associate. So, or maybe I was already promoted to principal, I can't remember, but I think different firms have different rules around who can actually take board roles. Like some principals can't take board roles, but usually it's a pretty obvious choice for within the partnership who has the best kind of chemistry with the founder. Sometimes the founder will let you know. I've been in the position where I've been asked to help the founder choose between 2 partners who should be on the board while I was the observer. And also who has the most kind of relevant style and industry expertise. I think style and personal chemistry is like more of an indicator of when you should take a board seat versus industry experience, actually. And when I felt like I wanted to dedicate more time or can negotiate a board seat, I take the board seat. Generally, you want to be able to negotiate the board seat if you can.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I can just squeeze a quick one in there. Thank you so much, Wendy, for today. It's funny because so much of the interview process to get into venture is, have you been in banking, you've been in consulting, and so you have these, these skill sets, and then becoming an operator at some point or having operating experience and having that empathy for the founders really becomes important. So as someone with no operational experience, how important is it to get that operational experience that I can be the most effective on a board? And then what type of operating experience, makes you the most effective senior investor and when you're sat on boards?
Do you mean within the venture role, or do you mean like taking another role and then like an operating role and then coming back into venture?
Yeah, I like just thinking about the future and if, to take an operating role outside the firm.
Yeah, I think chief of staff roles have great visibility into the organization. And they're kind of new and hypey these days. I think, product roles are really important to have kind of operating go-to-market roles, growth roles, I think are really interesting perspectives for board members to have. But ultimately, like, I don't think a founder comes to their VC for operating experience. Like they might ask for your opinion on a few things just to get some perspectives, but I would say there are ways to build that way to differentiate outside of needing to get like hands-on sort of like experience, converting funnels or something. I think, each company has its own unique situation. And so, and maybe it's also because biased, I haven't taken an operational role. So none of my founders come to me for operational advice. But I think it's also, I've heard it said that founders think that ex-operators can be too opinionated and want to run their business too. And so I tend to think it's more of like a style thing than actual experience. But those are the three, like, I think, functional roles. And within venture, if your idea is to stay, I think there's lots of different ways to get pattern recognition across companies. If you fully pay attention and absorb all of your board meetings, there's a lot of really great conversation that happens at those levels. And you can use that against your pattern recognition in the future. Like sometimes that can be more helpful. Let's say a company is struggling between these three go-to-markets, and you see in a company do the exact same thing before addressing the exact same markets. That is really helpful advice for them.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Wendy,
one last question.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks again, Wendy. One thing that some folks I work with have told me is to try to build relationships with non-CEO executive team members of the company, and to do that outside the room and see if you learn other perspectives you can bring to the discussion. Is that something you did as an observer? And if so, kind of how do you do that? Do you just kind of reach out cold? Do you try to have your board member help make that intro? Do you kind of only do it when you identify a problem?
Yeah, a couple of ways. When they first get recruited, you can ask to meet them, or the founder might ask you to meet them as a part of the interview process. You sometimes meet them at board meetings because they come in to present like a functional area. I think CFOs, come around for fundraising season, and like head of sales comes in for like the sales and commercial updates. And I think they're great people to get to know. Some of them will start companies. Some of them are great talent, like, people to have just like on your radar, because in the future, who knows, right? Like they might want to go into different companies, and this is how you build your network. And they're also usually lacking in board exposure and are very open to building relationships with the board members or board observers. But yeah, definitely, I highly urge you to do that.
Awesome. And we'll end with one final question from Nancy. Oh, you're muted.
Do you want to try typing it maybe?
Yeah, do you want to type it and I can read it?
It's not a Zoom call without at least one issue with audio.
Love that you shared a story of getting yelled at. The resilience of growing from constructive criticism is so important. It's great to see an example of that. Could you share more about your resilience and growth journey?
Can I share more about different partners yelling at me? Tons. So as I said earlier, I tend to err on the side of asking for permission rather than forgiveness. So it's taken me to interesting places where I have been able to get really constructive feedback from my partners, which I think has been really good. So, when I first joined Northzone, I dove straight into the crypto rabbit hole, and for a very traditional fund that like made no sense whatsoever. They didn't want to invest in digital assets. The LPs thought Bitcoin was a scam. And this was in 2015. So like a lot of people shared that same opinion. I was fascinated with what was happening in the Ethereum ecosystem. I pushed for a year and a half to build this investment thesis. Ultimately, they let me make, a bunch of seed investments from our fund into the space. But TBD if that was the right move. But I took a lot of personal risk, I think is my point. In a lot of the career decisions that I made at Northzone. And I think I'm lucky that I'm at a fund that allows you to do that without punishing you. Because I think, we're judging you on sort of the objectivity of the idea rather than whether or not you made the partners happy while you presented that idea, or if you ruffled any feathers along the way. If anything, I think ruffling feathers is a good thing, because I don't think people give enough direct feedback to women. Like, I don't think founders get enough like good direct feedback. I don't think women investors get good enough direct feedback. So if you can push their buttons a little bit as to make them give you direct feedback, I think that's a good thing. And they'll respect you more for it.
Awesome. Wendy, thank you so much. This was an awesome session. Appreciate everyone joining. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm Megan@firstround.com, and we'll chat with you guys all soon. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.